You ready to start? Yep. Hold on.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our quarterly webinar. This webinar is the title for this webinar is "Striving for a Successful Transition and Recommendations for a Better Process." We have two speakers today. One is our managing partner, Ed Guttenplan, and we have one of our principals, Carol Karansky. So before we get the webinar started, just a few housekeeping rules. To ask any questions, please use the question pane in the GoToWebinar dashboard on your screen. We will try to answer as many questions as possible. We will be polling our audience throughout the presentation. This will help us to get a sense of the participants and their experience. The webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded to www.wgcpas.com. So we're going to be talking about successful transitions today. They can happen, believe it or not. And it is critical to define success as it relates to your association. What may be successful for one may not be for the other. We will detail our top 10 recommendations to achieve success you are looking for. So before we start, we'd like to do our first polling question. We'd like to know who our audience is today. Please check whichever box applies for you. All right, we're going to give it a few more seconds to get everybody else in. All right, so it looks like we have about 61% of board members, and the remaining are mostly property managers with a few professionals. I guess we have no developers today. All right, so moving on to our top 10 recommendations. These are the topics that we will be covering. Be informed. Create a transition team of professionals, identify the issues, determine a viable strategy or steps to reach desired outcomes, understand the cost-benefit relationship, keep emotions at bay, create and maintain positive relationships, establish a communication plan for the process, continually manage expectations during the process, look positively to life after transition. So we're going to move to our first recommendation, and Ed's going to take those.
Good afternoon, everyone. Glad you're able to join us. We're going to talk about a number of aspects relating to transition, not so much the technical calculations, but rather all the things that go into this process that can help make it successful, in addition to the technical expertise that's brought to bear. So we start off with being informed. That's step one. Whoever on your team is leading the process, whether it's board members or board members together with professionals, it's important to learn what the process is all about. New homeowners just moving in or now approaching transition. This is a whole new world, an independent field of study about how to manage the transition process. And some of the ways you go about it is, first, as you start interviewing professionals, get as many professional perspectives as possible. Learn what their approach is, how they view transition, what are some of the ways that they want to help you with the transition process. A good source for this is the management company, who can help guide you on even who the professionals are to speak to other than themselves, and how to approach transition to be successful. There's a lot of reading you can do. Among them are CAI publications on transition. The National Association of Home Builders also has a very extensive white paper on transition. And we on our website have resources and copies of newsletters on the topic of transition. Also may be helpful to ask the builder their perspective on transition. You may learn a little bit about whether they're going to be helpful, how they want to work in the process. That will certainly inform you as to how to go about it most effectively. And then ask questions maybe of other board members or other members in communities who've gone through transition and may be able to give you some insight as to the process. So now that you've learned about, 10 CAI programs, of course, CAI from time to time has programs to teach you how best to go about the transition process. So now that you've learned about the process, what's next? And next is creating the transition team of professionals that you will work with in guiding you through the process. So how do you go about creating the team? I think the questions you want to ask are, what are the attributes you look for in each team member? As it relates to people on the board, do you want people with financial perspectives, building or engineering perspectives, understanding of the transition process itself, a legal background, or just good business sense? So you'll want to assemble the team. You next go to your professionals, and you'll go through an interview process, both with your professionals and with your homeowners. You need to understand what success means to each of the participants, meaning your board members. Make sure that you're all on the same page, and that success means what's balanced success for the overall community. As you talk to professionals, it's really important to understand the strategy used by each professional. We'll talk about that more in a bit, but you need to know who's looking for non-confrontational transition and those who are looking to put as much claim information on the table as possible, and you have to weigh through what approach is best. You need to understand the cost of services in the professionals. We're going to talk about this in a little bit as to whether and how you might want to go about that process. And then you have to evaluate whose approach is going to get you there most effectively with the best benefit, balancing all the factors, and what is the best approach for your community. So we created the transition team. The board's transition committee itself, once you've got the team, including the board's members, become an important part of the overall transition team. So you have professionals and you have board transition committee members that all comprise the transition team. Often the transition team may include community members that aren't board members that serve on the transition team. Now we go to recommendation 3 in identifying the issues and setting realistic expectations. So we learned about transition, we formed our team. Now let's identify the issues and set realistic expectations of what's going to happen. First step is, what are the issues? And being an accountant, the first thing I want to look at is, what do the financials say? And if there is a deficit, you need to be careful about jumping to a conclusion with respect to a deficit. And this speaks to all of the issues, financial issues. When you look at the financials, be careful you peel back the onion to understand what's going on. Just as an example, if you look at a community and you see that there is a large deficit and you quickly jump to the conclusion that it's the developer's fault, we have a claim, that may not be the correct conclusion. It may be a result of extra legal fees incurred because a homeowner brought suit. It could be an unusual snow year. There are lots of factors that enter into it, or actions that the board may have taken after the developer was no longer in control that gave rise to large expenditures and for which the developer may not be accountable. So we want to sort through what are the claims of concern, what are the size of the potential claims, so we can assess where we might want to go with our transition issues. The next would be to get legal counsel, understand what legal counsel would suggest after everybody's brought up to speed on the types of claims that might exist. Legal counsel is critical to evaluating whether it's a viable claim, and I'll explain that in a little bit, whether it's viable, whether it has support, and what are the other arguments that may diminish the claim. We want to bring on the engineer to see whether the engineer has a perspective on the issue, either with respect to construction defects or whether it has to do with the reserve funding that's been taking place while the developer's in control. And then, are the expectations balanced and realistic? And are there biases in the expectations? And you know, one of the things that we see often is that there are expectations created sometimes by professionals who want to make the case to maximize your claim. And while that may be okay, what needs to be carefully understood is what are the defenses that are going to be presented in countering the claims that you may have. And has the position that someone has put forth as a potential position to be sought after, has it been sustained in other cases? Has it been successful? Again, you want to avoid just putting as much stuff on the table as you can. There are reasons why that may not be a good strategy, and it's important to understand what the defenses are against some of the claims that will be made. And you want to understand biases in the expectation, whether it's homeowners who have particular issues they're upset about, or other biases by professionals about how to go about documenting and pursuing a claim. Here's a list of some of the typical claims that we see. We're not going to go into the details of these. They're covered in other seminars and articles we've written, or you're welcome to call any of us to talk about it. But these are some of the common items that we see these days: the inadequate public offering statement budget, benefits derived or operating fund deficit, operating deficit funding by the developer. All of these are about whether the developer fulfilled their financial obligation to the association.
But Ed, these are the common ones. There could be others besides this, right?
Sure.
I've had a situation where during the course of transition, suddenly they realized that there were actually some environmental remediation issues that they had to deal with.
Right. So these are the low-hanging fruit. Mohammed's right. There are lots of other ones that do come up, but these are the low-hanging fruits we see most often. And again, as I said, all of these have a positive way, meaning there is a claim here, but you need to understand what the defenses are against some of those claims that may not make it as large as you think it might be.
All right, so we have our second polling question now. So we'd like to know, at what stage in the transition process are you currently in? Are you just thinking about getting it started? Are you in the process of discussions with the builder? Are you almost done, or at some other stage of the process? Yeah, maybe you can give us some details about that. All right, so we're going to close the polling. So it looks like there are a few of you that actually do see the light at the end of the tunnel, but it seems that the majority are in the process and discussions with the builder. A few are thinking about it, depending on how many homes you have that are sold and at what level you are in when you're going to get started. So that's good to know. So we're going to move on to the next question.
Yeah. So now we're going to recommendation number 4, which is determining a viable strategy or steps to reach the desired outcome rather. Could be income that result, but it is an outcome.
So it's kind of interesting. I remember that, when I was buying my house a few years ago, and, the builder calls you in and tells you that, okay, these are all the upgrades that you have available, and suddenly your eyes light up and say, oh, I want this and I want that, and you make a list of everything that you want, and then suddenly you start seeing the costs of everything. Then you have to kind of tone down and peel back and say, okay, this is what I can really afford, right?
Right. So as you're thinking through the strategy, the whole team needs to be on board with figuring this out, which means understanding the process, what the claims are going to be, and what each person's role is in that process. So what we're trying to get at is, if the attorney has a particular perspective on how to pursue the claim based upon reading the association documents and looking at New Jersey law, but the accountant or the engineer say that we can't support that calculation, there's no way it works, or we don't have the information, or based upon our experience, this is not a valid way to calculate the claim, you'll have conflict. And it's not that one is right or not, it's you need everybody in sync on what the claims are going to be and how to support it. So there needs to be discussion about the approaches, the strategy, what we hope the outcome is, and can the accountant and the engineer create the support, the analytical support to pursue those claims. So the next step after you've kind of worked through some of that is, let's talk about some of the other steps that are in the process. And the first is time commitment by the team. So we have this elaborate claim we want to make against the developer, or a position we want to take. How much time is it going to take to gather the data to do that? What is each person's role? What's the timeline for us coming to a conclusion on this? And what has to be done to get there? That's important. It's going to inform everybody on what kind of process we're going to take, how complex it is, and also inform what's the cost and risks of this approach. And then you see the next line here is complexity of approach. Is it understandable and convincing, and is it realistic? Sometimes these can be really complicated and hard to explain and be able to convince a judge, a jury, or even the developer that you have a sustainable argument or position to take. So keeping it straightforward and simple is often helpful in being able to present a convincing case. This becomes very important if this ends up going to court, that you want something that a jury is going to understand and is not so overly complicated that it becomes difficult to justify. And then realistic. Obviously, these have to be realistic approaches. I'll talk about that more under cost-benefit. The professional fees are a factor as you figure out the strategy. What's the cost of all the professionals and experts that have to sustain the position? And then lastly, what are the other intangibles that you need to consider? And I'll just tell you one obvious one in my mind, which is, what's the PR impact of continuing issues with the community? So if it's a very nasty transition process, it doesn't reflect well on the community. So it's just one of those factors. Are there external PR issues with respect to the transition process? And secondly, is it becoming something internally that's divisive? And what's the cost benefit of creating that kind of environment?
And have you ever had the situation where sometimes the professionals, you're agreed on a strategy up front, and then things change a little bit, and different people no longer agree, at what point you then say, all right, should we change our strategy, or do we then have some professionals step out, other professionals step in? Is that something that you've seen, engineers go in and out, attorneys go in and out, or?
We have seen that, more so probably that the attorney they'll switch attorneys. It doesn't happen all that often, but it does happen as things unfold. And as I said before, understanding the approaches and how sustainable arguments are or positions is critically important, because if you start out with an unrealistic approach to transition and you find you're not making any headway, or you didn't fully explore all of the counter arguments, then you're going to end up having spent a lot of money on this process and find you don't really have a position that's sustainable, and then you start thinking about, do I have the right people on the team? So it does happen, and I think you minimize it by having realistic approaches up front, but it does happen.
The other item I was thinking about was in the timeline and everyone's role. The board members, if a board member is on the team, as we talked about previously, board members may be only on the board 2 years, and then there's elections and board members are in and out. How does that really affect this?
That's a good question. It does. It could affect the approach. One board member is all gung-ho and another one wants to settle quickly. I think formulating a team that has continuity that will last the entire transition process is critical. So that's a good question and a good thing to think about. Do I have continuity on my transition team that will continue the process beyond the loss of a board member or two? So the last thing in my section on the transition process is understanding the cost-benefit of this whole process. And this one is near and dear to me. I think it's critically important. And I think that the way that I look at it is this is my perspective about avoiding creating extreme positions just to tell everybody we're going after this big claim. And I say extreme meaning it's not, it's a reach to be supportable. You don't want to spend more money on a claim than it's worth. And in fact, I talk about this with the board. They find something that's, maybe there's a $10,000 issue in the financial records of the association. And they have lots of construction defect claims. And there's a $30,000 issue that's going to cost $10,000 in accounting fees to support. So my take on that is often not worth it to spend $10,000 on accounting for a $30,000 claim, because that $10,000 is going to carry with it legal fees to support the claim. And secondly, there's always risk with litigation that's going to diminish somehow something else that happens. So I think you need to think about what's the amount we're going after, and is there really a business case for it? When I go into a transition meeting, somebody says, can you come and talk to us or help us evaluate what our transition claim might be? The first thing I go through is, let's look at the financial statements. Let's look at what the potential issues are. Let's talk with the attorney and engineer about the prospects of sustaining our claim with the developer, and what could they possibly assert in their defense to diminish the likelihood our claim will be accepted. And that, to me, is step one. I know sometimes we're asked, can you come in and give us a quote to do a transition audit? And I'm really resistant to do that process, or at least give a quote on what a transition audit is. I'm not sure what that term actually means. I know what the intent is, which is come in and help us assess the potential for transition claims. So that is really phase one. Let's assess what our potential claims are and the amount of professional fees we're going to have to spend to sustain that. and then let's see if there's a business case for that. Unrealistic claims can be very costly. Not just the professionals who put the claim together, but the legal fees to continually argue those claims, and often they're not just accepted on their face value. Unrealistic claims can be costly in terms of the time and energy of the board and the goodwill that both parties have. Time and energy of the board is limited and precious, and I think you want to be careful how much of that you use in this process. Credibility is also important. When I see transition claims that I think are somewhat outlandish, I think it gives everybody ammunition to say, how can we believe that the claims by this expert are valid? They're incredulous. They're lacking credibility because they're so extreme, and therefore we're going to dismiss them. I think that's an important factor. There are tangible costs, as we spoke about, legal, accounting, and engineering, and often there's a back and forth on these. The legal one tends to be the more pronounced one, because you make a claim, the other side contests it, then you go back and forth, and it escalates pretty quickly, way beyond what you initially thought it would be to sustain the case. And as I said, don't risk diminishing your credibility, and it's critical to have the right professional team. I'll just give you one example. I have tons, but one example of a case I was on, and I've defended both. I've defended developers, and I have also represented associations in making claims. This happened to be one where a claim was made against the developer for not funding reserves in a particular community. And the claim was made for the full amount of reserves in the budget for a particular year in this association, and that was the claim made by the professional. Well, in fact, in that particular year, there were only a few units that actually closed, and most of the project was unbuilt. Now, you can imagine if you're going and explaining this to a jury, whether they're going to agree that the developer should have been funding for all of these items which hadn't yet been built. Now, there are ways to present that, and there are issues, but off the top, you can see that there's probably some risk in taking that position. And all it did was shine a light on the professional who presented it that way, that all you're after is coming up with the biggest number and not something that's intellectually honest, that we can both put our heads together and come up with a fair compromise on what the transition claim should be. So my parting advice is, please be realistic. You have a greater likelihood of settling favorably with a developer if you're realistic, and you have more at risk if you start making claims that are not sustainable.
Thanks.
Good.
Thanks, Ed. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Carol. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Carol.
Well, it's interesting that when you say about the credibility and the claim, because sometimes people say, all right, you're going to aim high because you know you're going to settle down. Like you go to sell your house and you put up a much higher sales price because you know you're going to have to lower it. So you don't think that somehow ties into here, like, okay, let's ask for more because we know we're going to have to settle.
Well, I think that you should go after every possible amount that you're entitled to. Where I find difficulty is when you're creating claims for which there's no substantive basis for the claim just to create a higher number.
Okay.
So that's where you run into problems of credibility and anger and all the other things. If you reach for every possible uncertainty, I think that's less of an issue to me than fabricating unrealistic claims.
Right. Okay.
I guess that one person whose price is much higher than any of the comparables when you're selling a house, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Thanks, Ed. Ed's here, so if you have any questions for him, absolutely, please type them in, and he'll be able to answer them. Now we'll turn over to Carol.
Thanks, Mohammed. Okay, so Ed talked a little bit about some of the technical aspects and that side of it. I'm going to talk a little on more the soft side of the transition process. And the first thing is really keeping emotions at bay. So really important that you resolve the disputes that you have with economics in mind, not emotion. Everybody has a lot invested, and people spend a lot of time, and sometimes you feel very strongly about a position, and you may lose sight of the fact that maybe it's not economical to do that anymore. And you have to think about, all right, what makes economic sense, and not necessarily whose idea is it or who came up with it, but what makes good sense. You don't want to dig your feet into the sand and draw a line and say, all right, we came up with this idea and this is what we're going to go with. If it's not economical to do, then sometimes you have to say, all right, let me rethink this. So it's important that you deal with your head and think clearly about it. It's not personal. It's really you want to focus on the good of the community. Often you'll have somebody that might say, okay, well, I came up with this idea and I feel strongly about it and I'm just going to fight through to the end. Well, that might not be the way to go. It's more important that you're focusing on the good of the community. The board, the transition team, all together, they're really looking for what's going to be best for the community as a whole, not for certain individuals. The other thing that's difficult in terms of keeping your emotions is, you need to manage the expectations of all involved. And there's a lot of parties involved, as Ed had talked about previously. You've got professionals, you've got committee members. Committee members could be board members, could be homeowners. Then you've got the homeowners that are not even involved in the process, but they know they're living in a home potentially that has a leak, or maybe their sidewalks crooked, or there's problems. So they have their own thoughts and their own process. And then you've got the builder. And the builder has their expectation of, this is probably not the first development they've built. It's probably not the first transition they've gone through. And they have an eye on how they believe it will probably go. So it's important to keep everybody calm and everybody focused together on what's for the good of the community, not what's just good for the committee or good for the homeowners or good for the builder. And as Ed mentioned, there's a lot of costs, and there's tangible and intangible. It's a long process, and if it's not kept calm and with economics in mind and becomes emotional, it will drag out, and it'll be a very difficult process over the long haul.
So Carol, once you've invested a certain amount of time and money, and at what time do you start reevaluating the path that you're taking, especially if you see that you're now moving in a direction that you really did not anticipate that you're going to be?
Well, that's really where you have to then go back to my first point here, Mohammed, and just really think about the economics. You can't spend good money after bad. I mean, at some point you have to say, all right, we're spending, and maybe this is not the way to go anymore. And that's where it's really critical to say, all right, I know this was my idea and I'm behind it 100%, but we're spending too much money and it just may not end up being worthwhile. So that's why it's so important to say, all right, this isn't about me, it's not personal, but what's best for the community. And you don't want to spend good money after bad. It's a hard decision to make, but you need to evaluate at all times.
Right, yeah, sometimes that really is a tough decision.
Yeah, it's almost like a continual evaluation. Where do we stand? That brings us to recommendation number 7, and creating and maintaining a positive relationship. So just as in everyday life, it's so much nicer when people get along and people are nice to each other. It's the same thing during the transition process. When there's unity among committee members, it makes for a much better process. Again, it's not about the good of the community, it's about the good of the community, not an individual's ego or an individual's agenda. And I keep bringing that up because, whenever there's a group of people working together, there have been times where some people are just stronger on one aspect or really want to push forth their specific agenda. You might have a board member that's on the committee that's also having a house that's having the most leaks in its roof. And so they're really focused on that. So you need to remember always, it's not about me, it's not about an individual agenda, but it's really what's best for the community, because we want to do the best we can during the transition process. And again, keeping positive relationships is a better outcome. No different in transition than, every day when you're at work and in life. The better everybody gets along, the more likely we're going to have a positive outcome at the end. And especially, you want to think about the fact that the builder may very likely still be active in the community. Potentially, the builder is building, maybe phase 4 or phase 5, or maybe they're building a development next door, or maybe they're maintaining the clubhouse, or maybe they maintain the garage. But they're still there, and if you get along and you have a good relationship, then it's much more likely that they're going to be helpful, and it's going to be a better working relationship throughout the transition. Good relationships can help with the builder, especially, if they're still doing build-out, and then there's transition problems and repairs that need to be made. They're there with their crews, and they're there with their landscapers, and maybe they can replace those trees and it's not such a big deal, or maybe they can help smooth out the sidewalks. They're already on site. So the more that you get along with the developer and keep it on a friendly note, when you can, sometimes, it escalates and that just is not possible, but the more you can stay positive, and while the developer is there, the more likely that they're going to be able to help you out, and it could work out to be a much better process. And then sometimes, because if you can talk and get along, it might even avoid lengthy litigation, and it could be something that could just be resolved through discussion.
Right. I've seen both sides of it. I've seen situations where the board and the developer actually do get along with each other, and the developer's actually gone out of their way to get things for the association, to sometimes replace things that were not their responsibility. And I've seen the other side of it where the builder's still involved. They may own the retail space, and the board and the builder don't get along, and things have stalled, and transition is just not moving, and there's a lot of name calling and stuff like that going on. So it's absolutely much better when the parties do get along and understand that we want to get past this and move on with our lives.
Right. That's everyone's responsibility. So it's, everybody on the team, and it really comes from, just a whole mindset. Let's try to make this work.
All right. So we're moving on to our third polling question here. How would you rate the community's relationship with the builder during transition? Do you have excellent terms and you're working it out without a lawsuit? Legal action has started, but negotiations are still underway, or it's a full-out warfare? All right, we're going to give it a few more seconds here. All right. So I'm happy to say that almost 2/3 are have excellent terms and are working it out without a lawsuit. A few have started legal action, but you're still negotiating. And for those who are unfortunately in the third position and there is a decent percentage here that are full-out warfare, I really hope you can kind of get back to the negotiating table and maybe somehow try and work this out, right, Carol?
Right, exactly. So maybe some of these recommendations that we have maybe will help you take it out of the full-out warfare situation. Unfortunately, sometimes it happens, but again, our experience through the many transitions that we've helped out with, is when the parties get along, it's just such a better process.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right, so on to recommendation number 8, and that's establish a communication plan for the process. So the communication plan, first of all, the main thing is we need to know who are the party or parties that are going to control the communication process. And the communication process is multifold. It's not just a one-way communication. So the process includes communication channel for discussions among committee members. And that's important for reasons. Are we having face-to-face meetings? Have we agreed upon that? Is it going to be documentation? Are we going to be sending letters, emails? Are there going to be phone calls? And, there could be some concerns as to whether we meet in person or not meet in person, and that also could involve costs of professionals, having everything written and documented. Maybe the attorney might say, okay, maybe we don't want to do that. So there's a lot of things to think about, but you need to make sure that you do have a communication channel so that everyone on the committee is well aware of how they are to communicate with each other. And that also helps with knowing that somebody's not left out. So you don't just have sidebars unless they're specifically intended to be that way. So then there's communication for discussions with outside professionals. So you've got your transition team, your internal team, which could be your board members or your community members. You don't want every individual calling the attorney. You're going to end up with quite a lot of legal bills and for no reason. You don't want to have everybody calling the accountant, the engineer. There should be one person that's responsible, or two people, however it's been determined, that should be calling the outside professional. For one reason, obviously it's going to cut down on costs, it's going to be far more efficient, and then it just helps that there's a good chain of command and there's nothing lost in between one person calling and another person calling. This way the people that are having the discussion has the whole picture. There should be a communication channel for discussions with builders. Again, same thing. You don't want everyone calling the builder. First of all, you know, the builder is busy and they're busy building, and they don't want to be stopping and talking to every individual person on the committee, and different committee members might have a different way of dealing with the builder. So it's important that the process is determined so that one person or two people deal and contact the builder. Additionally, the communication process also includes communication back to the community members. And things to think about are timing and the amount of information to disseminate. So we're all for full disclosure. It's important that everybody knows what's going on. However, there's things to think about. First of all, you don't want to give out any information that could possibly compromise the settlement if in fact you're involved in a lawsuit. There could be privileged information that should not be disseminated out. Additionally, you want to make sure whatever you give back to the community members is clear. It's not subject to interpretation, because then you'll have different people saying different things, and the message will get convoluted. So it's important that it be clear, concise, and if you are involved in a lawsuit or if you're in the middle of a claim, that this information going out to the community has been run by your attorney to make sure that there's nothing that can compromise the suit. So that would be important. Also, it's good to have a process for community members to give their input on construction deficiencies they've noted. They're going to be much happier, the community members, if they know that they're involved and their input is important. Of course, you've got your engineers and they've gone through and they've noted all the construction deficiencies, but it's possible that there might be things inside a house or something that maybe they haven't noted. And also, it just helps the community members to feel a part of it. Oftentimes in transition, if the costs do become high, there could be special assessments to cover legal costs and engineering fees. And if a community member is involved in the process, then they're happier to, not that anyone's happy to pay a special assessment, but they're more willing to pay the special assessment because they're part of the process. So it's important for them to have a say. Again, you don't want community members just going to every different person on the committee. There should be a distinct process for giving your input so that the entire committee is well aware of what the process is.
Just going back to when you had mentioned about, the transition team and communication, one thing I have learned is that if you're going to have a call or conference call, of course, making sure that the attorney is okay with that, make sure that there's some kind of recap so everybody knows what the expectations are and who's supposed to do what and what timeline.
Absolutely, right? Absolutely right. Whenever you have any kind of meeting, if you don't have a document, okay, who's doing what next and what's the due date, then you're just kind of rolling around and nothing's getting accomplished. Recommendation number 9 is continually manage expectations during the process. Now, Ed did talk about expectations and setting appropriate expectations and realistic expectations, but what I just want to address is that you want to manage them throughout the process because things can change throughout the process. The first bullet up here is actions can escalate into unrealistic expectations. So if you didn't follow my recommendation, I believe it was number 6, about keeping your emotions in check, it could be that you get heated and say, okay, well, heck with this, and I want the most I can from this lousy builder, and your actions just escalate into something that's unrealistic. And so that's really important, that you want to manage that, and you don't want your expectations to all of a sudden to change into something. You don't ever want to overcommit in communications with the community. We don't want a board or a committee saying, we are going to get every single penny, and this builder is not getting away with leaving us how we were. You don't want to overcommit. You want the community to understand realistically what you're trying to get, and make sure that you haven't set expectations that you're expecting $1 million settlement when in fact you might be looking at $200,000. You got to remember to compromise. So this is just another one of those things you learned in kindergarten. You have to compromise. It just helps in the process and helps to make sure that things don't go into something that's unrealistic. And remember to be reasonable. Again, if you're not reasonable, then emotions take over, and that's a problem. So expectations may change throughout the process. As new information is obtained, expectations can change. You might end up with a lower, higher, or a different claim. Sorry about that, or a different claim altogether. So you start out and the engineer has come through and done their initial study, but as things come along, it may turn out, well, wait a minute, the roofing that was there, it's turned out that, yes, it does. Actually, it has a 40-year life. It doesn't have a 20-year life. So you might need to lower that claim, or you might find out things that weren't initially included were now included, and you might have a higher claim. Additionally, something that was never even thought about could come in. So information is being obtained throughout the process. Information is being obtained from the engineer, from the attorney, from the accountant, from the homeowners, and as a result, you need to evaluate it and say, okay, how does this affect my claim? And think about this. Does this help my claim and just support the claim I have? Or now, based on the information that I've received, is my higher claim, the claim that I originally had, is that now an unrealistic claim? And if so, we need to lower the claim.
Carol, you're absolutely right. I've seen situations where things changed during the transition process, and the board had kept expectations very high with the homeowners and did not keep them informed to a certain degree as to what was happening. And when they settled, the settlement was much less than what they anticipated, and now they actually they were concerned, how are we going to tell the homeowners that, oh, now the money that we got is much less than what we told you we were going to get.
Right. And then sometimes that board, even though that they've done the best they could do, that board members might just be voted out because the community is thinking, oh, well, they did a lousy job, when in fact maybe they did a great job. Absolutely. And they should have really been letting the unit owners know. Right. Okay, and the last recommendation, look positively to life after transition.
Really?
That's the way attitude is everything. So remember, all the issues were addressed during transition. Transition is done. You have a settlement. Whether, whatever the settlement is, it is. So you want to focus on the settlement dollars that were received. And now think about how we're going to use those settlement funds. We want to identify the projects to be completed. You need to think about the costs of the projects and the timeline. And then you want to think, how much do I need to retain for operating needs? So the settlement's done. You don't want to, at this point, you don't want to start going back and saying, well, we can't do this project because we don't have enough money. The developer didn't give us what we wanted. No, we're done. Let's start thinking about the future, think about the amount of money you have, and what's the best use of the funds that you have to make repairs that are necessary.
Carol, can I jump in for a minute?
Sure.
Because while it's beyond the scope of this presentation, I just want to alert the listeners that there are tax aspects to the settlement and how the dollars are defined and where it's put once it comes in. I think that it's something important to talk with your accountant about so you can avoid potential tax traps in monies coming in potentially being taxable. Sometimes it takes a little bit of upfront thinking about this before you sign a settlement agreement, and then ultimately as the money is deposited, putting it in the right places with the right explanations so that you can minimize the income tax.
Excellent point. And I guess lastly is in thinking about life after transition, as we talked about earlier, the developer, the builder may still be in the picture. Keep being nice, keep those relationships good, regardless of what the settlement was, because again, if they're on site, they can still be a helpful asset to you. So we're pretty much that, and again, the importance of maintaining a good relationship. So that covers our recommendations. Here is just a visual recap of what our top 10 were.
Right.
And that's about all I have, Mohammed.
Yeah, there are situations sometimes, as we all know, we don't get everything that we wanted. And sometimes
we learned that in kindergarten.
Right, absolutely. And sometimes you have work that needs to be done, but once you've been through the transition process and the settlement is not enough, then sometimes you have to go back, and that's where your professionals again can help you with working out, okay, this is the pot that we have. How do we make sure that we have enough money to do those projects, and maybe we do need to do a special assessment after all to cover the balance that's not there, correct?
Right. Mm-hmm.
So, it could happen. Unfortunately, sometimes it does, but you have to still have a positive outlook and think about moving forward and getting past this and enjoying the association and the community that you live in.
Exactly, exactly.
So that brings us to the end of our presentation today. If you have any questions that you can think about later on, please feel free to email them to us and we will get back to you. I want to thank Carol and Ed for giving this presentation. And as we said earlier, these are some of the resources that are available. Our website, or you can go to the CEI website, and they have resources as well. They also do presentations and education seminars relating to transition. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.